Welcome. We're with our distinguished and very special guest, independent scientist and radiation expert, Leuren Moret, M.A., Ph.D., A.B.T. Now, welcome, Leuren.
Thank you, Alfred.
You recently made a statement, and Ecology News is publishing it, that Hawaii and the Pacific Islands are, quote, unsafe for human habitation and swimming in the adjacent Pacific Ocean. And that's quite a statement for a scientist to make. And I guess that's really the subject of our conversation and interview today. Why did you come to the conclusion that Hawaii, the 50th state of the United States, and the Pacific Islands, which you'll get into in more detail, are, quote, unsafe for human habitation and swimming in the Pacific Ocean?
Well, the reason is because of it's really accumulated information over time since the Fukushima disaster happened. But it's also because I'm a geoscientist, and so I understand atmospheric circulation and the circulation in the oceans. It's all fluid dynamics. It's just an engineering concept of physics, a physical constant. But when you look at the amount of radiation that's been released from Fukushima, now no one really knows. We don't know who's telling the truth. We know a lot of people are lying. We know that right after Fukushima happened, in the weeks and months afterwards, that all governments were covering up the real levels, and the only data that international scientists that I work with, for instance, Dr. Busby in England, the only data that we trusted was from the monitoring stations that are buoys all over the oceans of this planet, and they are privately maintained by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty organization that monitors radiation in the environment for treaty verification. So they are independently supported, and they did report accurately and globally what the radiation levels were. They were horrendous. They were horrific. But another thing that happened in August is that a Chinese scientific paper came out with very interesting data. It was a map of 1.5 years after the Fukushima disaster with the cesium levels, and it showed the tsunami debris field, which is all contaminated with radiation, extending nearly from offshore from California, from the West Coast, all the way to offshore from China. So this debris field is trapped between east-west currents, two currents that split off of the Kuroshio current, which starts in Taiwan. It goes north up past Japan, and at the top of Honshu, which is the biggest island, and before you get to Hokkaido, it splits, it joins with the Oyama current, which is coming out of the Arctic, and then they go off straight east into the Pacific, across the Pacific Ocean. They split, and the tsunami debris field is between the split currents that extend all the way across the Pacific. And so these islands, in particular, one part of the Kuroshio current, which is the strongest current in the world, goes directly to the Hawaiian Islands. So that current is 3,300 to 3,500 feet deep. and it's also 75 kilometers wide, nearly 60 miles wide, and it's traveling 2 or 3 miles an hour to up to 9 miles an hour. And it's a tremendous force. It's part of the Great Conveyor Belt that circulates around the Pacific and the Atlantic. And all of this radiation is being distributed all over the world. It's already completely mixed in the global atmosphere in 1 year because of all of the convection. And what drives it is the very cold polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic, and the very hot equator. And hot air and cold air want to mix. And the bigger the temperature difference, the more violent the mixing is.
Right. So the polar vortices may be even more, have more of an effect of mixing the radiation. Is this part of the weather warfare for spreading Fukushima radiation?
Well, what the weather warfare, this weather climate change meme or fraud that is being perpetrated from England and also from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, Nuclear Weapons Lab, where I worked. And one day in about 1989, I walked down a hall in the Lawrence Livermore Lab. I was a staff scientist, and I saw a door open, and I looked through the doorway as I walked by, and it was a big room full of young hotshot computer scientists, all sitting in these gigantic desk chairs or computer chairs at these huge monitors. And I said, "What is that group?" And somebody said to me, "Oh, that's the climate change group." And I went, "Oh, more science fraud at Livermore." And that's exactly what it is. This is my goodness. It's 20 years later. No, it's longer. Yeah, 20 years later. I'm sorry. Everything that I suspected then has been proven because people were so fed up, scientists who are honest, were so fed up with all this fraudulent, quiet climate change scam, and they hacked into the headquarters in England and into the Lawrence Livermore Lab, and they got thousands of emails between the British climate change scientists and the U.S. climate change group at Livermore, and they proved that the whole climate change concept is completely fraud, and it's actually been perpetrated and made up and promoted from the City of London and the Queen of England to promote nuclear power so that she can sell her uranium. Queen Elizabeth owns all of the uranium in Canada, in much of Africa, and in Australia. And there's no way for her to peddle that useless energy unless she can sell it for weapons or for nuclear power. So that in itself, to think and realize that Queen Elizabeth's uranium has poisoned the world, all of the depleted uranium weapons, Iraq, Afghanistan, everywhere we've used them, Yugoslavia, that's all Canadian uranium, and it's completely illegal because it violates the Canadian Constitution.
Right. Now, what you said is, quote, "Anyone with a desire to stay healthy should never go to Hawaii or any Pacific islands in our lifetime." And then you go on, as you explained, one of the main Pacific Ocean currents is carrying the radiation from Fukushima directly east across the Pacific Ocean. Does that mean that you believe that Hawaii should be evacuated at this time?
We said that right after Fukushima happened. All of the Pacific Islands north of the equator should be evacuated. They should have been evacuated as soon as Fukushima happened. And even the northern one-third of Japan should have been evacuated, including Tokyo. Of course, that would be very difficult and incredibly expensive to do, and they're not going to do it because the people who have perpetrated this global outrage, they are using radiation, nuclear weapons, radiation, nuclear power, which produces fission products, and they're creating a global nuclear pollution situation, which is going to have many biological and ecological effects that are not favorable to life on this planet. And they are combining nuclear weapons and nuclear pollution for depopulation with HARP technologies and applications, such as the Fukushima tectonic nuclear warfare disaster, where they triggered the Tohoku earthquake at Fukushima with HARP and caused it to release huge amounts of fission products, which is a silent global nuclear war. And there's no place to hide. The tuna at the Tsukiji fish market in Tokyo, which I've been to many times, it's over a square mile, it's huge. And there are all these people running around with chainsaws sawing up frozen whales and frozen tuna and just huge fish and everything, and even sea mammals. The price of tuna this year at their sale, which started a few weeks ago, was 95% down from what they were paying for tuna last year. In other words, the price was 5% this year of what they paid 100% for last year. So the tuna industry, the fish industry is just falling through the floor in Japan, and China and Russia have said they are curtailing imports of food from the west coast of North America, and they may not buy any more fish. We know that the Pacific Ocean, the seaweed, the fish, the plankton, everything is contaminated now from Fukushima. This is from the Arctic all the way to the Antarctic. And this great conveyor belt that controls the world climate, it's actually the heat sink for the world's climate, circulates through the Pacific and then back through Southeast Asia into the Atlantic, around the Atlantic, back through Southeast Asia, around the Pacific. So this is just a giant mixing machine in the oceans. And then the air also behaves as a fluid, and that has an even more turbulent, more violent, more convective mixing effect that's much faster than in the oceans.
And I guess that's really the subject of our conversation and interview today. Why did you come to the conclusion that Hawaii, the 50th state of the United States, and the Pacific Islands, which you'll get into in more detail, are, quote, unsafe for human habitation and swimming in the Pacific Ocean? Welcome. We're with our distinguished and very special guest, independent scientist and radiation expert, Leuren Moret, M.A., Ph.D., A.B.T. Now,
constant. But when you look at the amount of radiation that's been released from Fukushima, now no one really knows. We don't know who's telling the truth. We know a lot of people are lying. We know that right after Fukushima happened, in the weeks and months afterwards, that all governments were covering up the real levels, and the only data that well, the reason is because of it's really accumulated information over time since the Fukushima disaster happened. But it's also because I'm a geoscientist, and so I understand atmospheric circulation and the circulation in the oceans. It's all fluid dynamics. It's just an engineering concept of physics.
welcome, Leuren.
Thank you, Alfred.
You recently made a statement, and Ecology News is publishing it, that Hawaii and the Pacific Islands are, quote, unsafe for human habitation and swimming in the adjacent Pacific Ocean. And that's quite a statement for a scientist to make.